And welcome back, intrepid travelers. It's time to talk about Necropolis. God damn how I wanted this game to be great, it's one of those games where first impressions aren't going to be indicative of your final thoughts. Originally, it's a game that grabs you with its alien art style, the level of humor in the story and environment, and the general enjoyment to be had from gameplay in those earlier areas. I originally played multiplayer with a friend and we had a great time going through these levels, avoiding the friendly fire mechanics, and just looting up and killing bigger and better things. It was a great experience, but the more I played, and after several hours, it's an experience that quickly fails to satisfy and live up to what you expect of it. At its core, it both fails to meet its two main premises of being a good Souls-like and even a good roguelike game. First, its roguelike elements are just way too minimal. There isn't enough to differentiate between each new dungeon run. Each experience feels far too similar, and that is a problem for a game that involves running these repeated dungeon runs over and over and over again. The level design is randomly generated and the paths you take to progress are relatively unique, but too often I felt I was retreading the same dungeon spaces, as the environment feels way too familiar in many spaces. The same corridors and swamps pop up at nearly the exact same levels, the same assets prop throughout these levels, and of course the exact same monsters over and over and over again. The different levels of the dungeons do introduce newer, bigger and more dangerous monsters, though they're always still surrounded by these same trite you've killed tens and hundreds and thousands of times before. It just becomes a little too stale too quickly. There's also this distinct lack of variation between weapons and items and potions and spells too, and this creates far too much repetition throughout the gameplay. There are only a handful of different weapon types, and while they do contain different elements at times, it is still the basic form of combat, swinging in a particular way a certain amount of damage. The potions and magic give a little more variation, but even then they only have a certain small pool to choose from, and in terms of effects and abilities, they're often way too cumbersome to use in the heart of battle as well. And don't get me started on the use of food throughout and how your max endurance level lowers every time you charge your major attack. This means constant downtime to craft food and recover, which ruins the flow of this combat and exploration. Yes, I guess you don't have to charge that large attack and kill things, but then the whole combat slows down dramatically while you try and chip away at these certain enemies, dodging and all that kind of stuff. It just becomes way too slow and plodding without using that mechanic, and way too frustrating to do it. Even the progression aspect feels incredibly limited as well. And this is the aspect that is the most important sometimes. When you die, you gain a certain currency, and a certain amount depending on how well you did. And with this, you can spend it to access certain tombs. These tombs then grant some incredibly vague buff to your character, but the problem is you can only equip one at a time. And once you have purchased and found the right one for you, the overall progression is basically meaningless. Sure, you can get skins and such too, but nothing that really changes or improves the gameplay that much. Nothing that makes each new run more enjoyable, or at least each failure something you can stomach a little better. Without this progression and the variation in dungeon runs, the main roguelike aspect is just permadeath, resetting your progress now and then. And in my mind, permadeath as a primary mechanic doesn't make your game a roguelike. It just makes it annoying. And then we get to the Dark Souls-like aspect of the game and how it seemingly fails as well. The combat feels way too floaty, with attacks not activating and hitting as smoothly as you expect. The animations are janky and unwieldy, and the controls not that well polished either. They would often activate the next chain and attack when all I had wanted was maybe one or two strikes, and this then leaves you incredibly open to a counterattack. The hitboxes seem rather off at times too, and the aiming attacks not as precise as you would need them in something this punishing. The enemies are rather ungainly as well. They have certain specific animations with their attacks, but they aren't particularly predictable at times. Sometimes, yes, most enemies, I guess, will, attack you with their certain animations, their certain combos they have, but then other times it will be like 1 or 2 seconds before you thought it was going to happen, or they didn't follow their specific animations the way they usually do, attacking at odd times and angles that are against that usual. And this breaks that flow of combat. You are so trained to think and analyze and predict these enemies. And that's part of that roguelike. That's a way of getting around the punishing aspect of the experience. But when you can't do that, the entire Dark Souls-like action combat that's punishing but combatable just falls apart underneath you. Movement feels rather unpolished as well. Running and turning feels a little off, sometimes a little sluggish with how it controls. There is an auto-aiming mechanic, but it can fail sometimes as well. And when you are surrounded by enemies, it isn't that helpful. There is a small dash, but often enough it doesn't take you out of the damage. And sometimes they just auto-target you wherever you go anyway, attacking you where you land. There are also these rather weird camera issues where the screen will stutter. Sometimes your vision is obscured by the environment. I know when I've dodged a couple of times, the camera hasn't, caught up as quickly as I thought it could. And then there are times where I would find myself completely turned around due to certain visual and graphical glitches. I really did like the idea behind Necropolis though. A precise and punishing roguelike dungeon crawler does sound pretty great. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Hyperlight Drifter, and I thought this was going to be a more repeatable dungeon crawling version of that. The art style is incredibly unique and rather striking. It is bright and colourful. It is still able to maintain that dark, oppressive feeling while exploring these dungeons. I even enjoyed the humour the game contained with the way the main force, the Overseer, talks down on you, as well as the humorous lore pieces placed around the walls. It creates a more defined distinction between the levity of this dungeon crawling and imminent death and that pure form of fun and enjoyment I like in my games. But unfortunately, it falls flat in what it aimed to do, and as such, I just don't see any longevity there. Even in the short term, a few runs is enough to become rather bored with this experience. I wanted it to be so much more. It could have been so much more. And its failure to meet that is extremely disappointing to me. I'm hoping to see some more post-release updates with it. I know they are releasing some new characters soon. But even then, I just don't think they are able to change that core experience enough to make it as enjoyable and as repeatable as it should be. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time.